My name is Margaret Holloway. I'm 38 years old. 3 days after my father's funeral, my stepmother changed the locks on the house he built with his own hands and moved her daughter into my childhood bedroom. She had filed a title transfer the same morning we buried him. Same morning. I stood on that doorstep with a bin bag of his things she'd left outside. His reading glasses, his shaving brush, a cardigan that still smelled like him, and she told me through the intercom that I had no legal right to be there. What she didn't know was that 47 minutes before she changed those locks, I had found a biscuit tin behind the wardrobe in his study. And inside that tin was a document dated 11 years ago that she had never seen, because he had never told her it existed. The morning a judge handed the deed back to me in open court, Mercer sat 2 rows behind me and said nothing. Not one word. Before I tell you what was in that tin, hit subscribe, hit like, and let's go back to the beginning. Because this story starts the way most betrayals do, with someone who seemed perfectly ordinary. My father built that house in 1979 with a mortgage he could barely afford and a second driving lorries at weekends. He told me that story so many times I can recite it in his voice. He'd say, "Margaret, I mixed that cement myself. The front step, that was me. So if it ever cracks, you know who to blame." The front step never cracked. His name was Kenneth Holloway. Ken to everyone who knew him. He was a civil engineer by trade and a craftsman by temperament, the sort of man who believed that things done well lasted, and things done badly were an insult to the materials. He built bookshelves for every room. He repointed the chimney himself at 62. He kept the garden in a way that looked effortless and was entirely not. I am his only child. My mother, Patricia, died when I was 11, a brain aneurysm, sudden and catastrophic, and in no way fair. I know that life is not designed to be fair. But I'd be lying if I said her death didn't shape every relationship I had afterward, including the one with my father. After Mum died, it was just the 2 of us in that house on Skipton Road. And for a long time it was enough. My father didn't date. He cooked dinner every evening. He came to every school play and every parents' evening, always in his good jacket, always with a small bunch of flowers from our garden for whichever teacher had agreed to see him. He read to me until I told him I was too old, and then he read to himself in the armchair by the fire while I did the same on the sofa, and somehow that felt like the same thing. I grew up. I went to university in Leeds, English and education. Came back, trained as a teacher, and got a job at a primary school in Knaresborough, 20 minutes from home. I moved into a flat in town, the way you do, but I was at Skipton Road every Sunday without fail. Roast dinner, the crossword, the 6 o'clock news. He always had the kettle on before I was through the door. The house was not grand. 3 bedrooms, a sitting room with a bay window that faced the garden, a kitchen extension Dad built in 1991 with help from his friend Malcolm. The ceilings were lower than modern houses, and the radiators were older than me, and in winter you could feel a draught through the front door that no amount of draught excluders entirely cured. None of that mattered. It was home. It was the place on earth where I most completely understood who I was. I want you to hold that. Because the story I am about to tell you is ultimately about what happens when someone decides that your sense of home, your history, your belonging, the house your father built with his own hands, is something they are entitled. My father was 67 when he met Diana. I was 31, and I want to be honest with you about some before I go any further. I did not dislike her immediately. That would have made everything simpler, and this story has almost nothing simple in it. When I think about what happened to my father, what happened to me, I have to start with the truth. For almost a year I thought she was good for him. She was good for him. For a while. Her name was Diana Mercer. She was 59. She'd been widowed 5 years earlier. She had one daughter, Camille, 34, living in Leeds. She met my father at a gardening club in Harrogate, which sounds charming because it was. He liked begonias. She liked dahlias. She complimented his sweet peas. He showed her how to stake delphiniums. By the time I found out they were seeing each other, they'd been going on walks together for 3 months, and he was happier than I'd seen him in years. He called me on a Thursday evening to tell me. I should have mentioned it sooner, he said in the tone he used when he knew he should mention something sooner. I said, "A few months." "I know. Are you happy?" "A pov?" "I think I might be. I drove over that Sunday and she was there for the first time. She'd brought a Victoria sponge. She was warm and well-spoken and asked me questions about my class. I had year 3s that year and laughed at my stories about the children. She seemed genuinely interested in my father. She touched his arm when she talked to him. He sat up straighter when she came into the room. I drove home thinking, he deserves this. Everything. He deserves this. They married 14 months later. I was a bridesmaid. Diana's daughter Camille was the other. There were 40 guests at a hotel in Knaresborough, and afterward everyone went for a meal that Dad had organized far more carefully than Diana had, because he was that sort of man. The centerpieces were flowers from his own garden. He'd pressed his suit and bought a new shirt, and he looked, genuinely, like a man who had found something he wasn't expecting. I danced with him at the end of the evening, when most people had gone. He held my hand in that formal way he had, proper ballroom hold, the way he'd been taught as a boy, and he said, "She won't replace your mum, Margaret. You know that." "I know, Dad. But I don't want to be alone anymore." "I don't want you to be alone either." He squeezed my hand. He smelled of his aftershave and just slightly of red wine. "You're a good girl," he said, which he'd been saying since I was small, even though I was not a girl anymore. "I'm proud of you." Diana moved into the house on Skipton Road that November. The changes were gradual. That's the important thing to understand. Not a transformation, a slow, methodical replacement. A photo moved. A piece of furniture gone. A room repainted in a color my mother would never have chosen. My father's reading armchair, the one he'd had for 30 years, the one with the wooden arms and the cushion shaped exactly to him, appeared in the garage one afternoon because Diana felt it looked tired. He bought a new sofa that was larger than the room really wanted. None of these things were, individually, catastrophic. You couldn't object to any one of them without sounding unreasonable. That, I came to understand, was precisely the point. The Sundays changed first, not cancelled. Diana had family commitments. Diana liked to visit Camille in Leeds on Sundays. Dad suggested we move our dinners to Saturdays. I changed my schedule. Then Camille began to Saturdays, which was fine, except that Camille had opinions about everything, and a way of talking over my father that I found difficult to watch. Camille was not malicious. Not then. She was simply one of those people who take up exactly as much space as they feel entitled to, and somehow had been raised to feel entitled to all of it. She had her mother's confidence without her mother's care for other people's feelings. She would rearrange the things on Dad's kitchen counter while talking to him about something else. She reiterated the spare bedroom, my old bedroom, without being asked, because she was staying more often. She put a mirror on the wall that I later found out had been my mother's, moved up from the box room without comment. My father did not object to any of this. He had never been good at confrontation. It was the one area in which his careful nature failed him entirely. He believed that peace was better than conflict, and that love required accommodation. He'd always believed that. With my mother it had worked because she was reasonable. With Diana and Camille, it meant he accommodated everything without ever examining the direction of travel. The first time I tried to talk to him about it, it was a Saturday in March and Camille had just referred to the sitting room as Mum's room in a conversation about the furniture. "Did you hear that?" I said, when Camille had gone to the kitchen. He said, "She called it Mum's room. That's your sitting room, ours." He looked uncomfortable. "She means Diana, love. It's just a turn of phrase. It's not, though." "I'm not trying to start something. I just want you to notice it." He was quiet for a moment. "Diana has made this house a home again," he said. "She's brought life into it. I don't want to pick at that." I let it go. I shouldn't have. But I didn't know then what I know now, that the small things are never just small things. The next 3 years are both long and difficult to tell clearly, because what happened was not a series of dramatic moments. It was an accumulation. Layer on layer, so gradual that each new layer felt like a small extension of the one before it. Diana, the neighbors' WhatsApp group, and referred to herself as the lady of the house, which some people found charming and others found odd. She began answering the door at Skipton Road when I rang the bell, something that had never happened before, because I had always had a key, and she would tell me that Mother was resting or busy in the garden, and could I come back. Not often enough to be a pattern you could point to, just often enough to unsettle me. My key stopped working in the spring of the second year. I told myself the lock had been changed for security reasons. The neighbors 2 streets over had had a break-in, and didn't press it. But I noticed that Camille had a key. She let herself in while I was there once, without knocking, and Diana didn't look up from what she was doing. I was 34 when my father had his first stroke. It was mild. That's the word they use, mild, as though mild strokes are small inconveniences rather than the first warning of what the body is preparing to do. He came home hospital after 4 days. He was slower afterward, more tired. He needed a walking stick for a while, and though he was vain in his quiet way, he accepted it. Diana was, I have to be honest, attentive during this period. She managed his medication. She drove him to appointments. She adapted the bathroom with rails and a shower seat. She cooked for him every evening, which he needed, and she was patient with his frustration when the physical limitations angered him. I watched all of this and was grateful for it, genuinely. But I also noticed other things. I noticed that I began to receive information about my father's health from Camille, not from Diana, and not from Dad himself. Camille would text me brief, factual messages to say that Dad had had a bad night, or that the doctor had adjusted his medication, or that he was tired and perhaps I should ring before coming over. She framed these messages as helpful. They were not helpful. They were control. I noticed that when I called Dad directly, the calls were often short. He would say he was fine, he was tired, he was watching the television. The man who had once talked to me for 40 minutes about a problem with the guttering could no longer seem to sustain a conversation. I told myself this was the stroke. I told myself this was age. I was 34 and 35 and 36, and I had children in my classroom who needed me. And I talked myself into accepting that the shape of my relationship with my father had simply changed. Looking back, I want to shake myself. But grief does strings to perception. And hope, the hope that things are fine, that the people you love are being looked after, that the world is functioning the way it should, is one of the most powerful distortions there is. The first concrete thing I documented was in October, when I was 36. I had come over on a Saturday to find my father convinced in a way that went beyond fatigue. He called me by his sister's name twice, and then looked frightened when he realized. I rang the GP from the car outside and was told that his medication had been changed the previous week. I hadn't been told. When I mentioned this to Diana, she said she hadn't thought to call because she hadn't wanted to worry me. I sat in the car for a long time after that. I started writing things down. Not for any specific purpose. None. It was something I'd told children in my classroom. When something upsets you and you don't know what to do with it, write it down. Started book. What I'd observed, what I'd been told, what I could see didn't match. By the time I filled the first notebook, I had been writing for 4 months, and I had 31 entries. By the time my father died, I had 3 notebooks. My father had a second, smaller stroke in January when he was 71. He recovered, but the recovery was slower and less complete. He was tired in a different way afterward. A bone-deep tiredness that I recognized, from the reading I'd done, as the body beginning its final negotiation. He still knew me. He still smiled when I came in. He still managed to be wry about the indignities of being unwell. But there was a diminishment, and we both knew it, even if we didn't so directly. That February he asked me to help him go through some things in his study. Dana, at a garden center with Camille. He had waited for them to leave, and I understood without being told that this was deliberate. We sat in his study, which was still, somehow entirely his, because Diana had redecorated every other room but hadn't touched this one. And he went through his filing cabinet drawer by drawer. He showed me where things were. His will was with his solicitor, a man named Philip Garrett at Garrett and Baines in Harrogate, whom he had used for 30 years. His insurance documents were in a blue folder. His pension information was in a red folder. He was methodical and clear, the way he'd always been, and I held myself steady through all of it, because I knew what this conversation was, and I wasn't going to make it harder than it had to be. Then he went to the wardrobe in the corner, an old dark oak wardrobe he'd had from his parents, and he moved aside the boxes stacked at the bottom, and he reached to the very back and pulled out a biscuit tin. Green, with a faded painting of a Highland scene on the lid. I remembered it from childhood. He used to keep foreign coins in it. He held it out to me. "This is for you," he said. "Not to open now, when the time comes." "Dad, Margaret." He said my name the way he always said it when he didn't want me to argue. "When the time comes, not before. You'll know when." He put the tin of hands and they closed around it automatically, and then he looked at me for a long moment in that quiet, accurate way he had. "I trust Philip Garrett," he said. "When you need him, use him. Don't let anyone tell you you can't." I didn't understand what he meant. I thought being cautious, making sure I knew how to navigate things the way a careful man does when he sees the end coming. I thought the tin contained letters, perhaps, photographs. I took it home that evening, and I put it in the wardrobe in my flat, and I didn't open it. I kept my promise. He died at home on the 14th of April, 7 weeks later. A third stroke, in the early morning. Diana found him. She called me at 6:47, and I was there within the hour, but he was already gone, and I stood in the doorway of the bedroom that had been my parents' bedroom, and had become his and Diana's bedroom, and I thought, with absolute clarity, I don't know to exist in a world where he isn't in it. I sat in the kitchen while the doctor came and went, and the undertaker, and various neighbors who had been fond of him. Diana was composed and efficient in a way I was not, and I was grateful and also hollowed out and also, though I didn't know why yet, uneasy. Camille arrived before midday. She embraced me and said how sorry she was, and her eyes were already moving around the room while she said it. We buried my father on the 20th April. His friends from the gardening club came. His former colleagues came. Malcolm, who had helped him build the kitchen extension in 1991, came. and he wept properly and without embarrassment, which I respected. The vicar said the right things. We sang "The Lord's My Shepherd" because Dad had always liked it, pragmatic about religion in the way that a certain generation of Yorkshiremen were. I went back to my flat that evening. I sat on the bed for a long time. Then I went to the wardrobe and I took out the biscuit tin. Inside there was a sealed envelope with my name on it in his handwriting, not his later handwriting, which had grown shaky, but his earlier hand, neat and angular. Beneath the envelope was a document in a clear plastic folder. I opened the envelope first. He had written 4 pages. I will not share all of it. Some things are not for sharing, but the relevant part, the part that changed everything, read like this: Margaret, if you're reading this, then I've gone, and you'll be managing without me, which I know you can do because you are more capable than you've ever given yourself credit for. I want to tell you something I should have told you before, but I was afraid of what it would cause between you and Diana while I was still alive, and that was cowardly of me, and I'm sorry for it. Before I married Diana, I had the house on Skipton Road placed in a deed of trust in your name, with me as sole trustee during my lifetime. I did this on the advice of Philip Garrett, who was rightly concerned that, without such a protection, my marriage could complicate your inheritance, which I have always intended to be yours. The house was your mother's home and mine, and it is your home, and I built it, and it belongs to you. Diana knows nothing about this arrangement. This was wrong of me, but I was afraid that telling her would damage what we had, and I was selfish enough to want what we had while I was here to enjoy it. I'm not proud of this. The document in the tin is a certified copy of the trust deed. The original is with Philip Garrett. Go and see him, Margaret. Don't wait. Don't let anyone tell you that you have no right to that house. You are your father's daughter and the deed says so. I love you. I'm sorry. Didn't tell you sooner. I sat on the floor of my bedroom and I read that letter 4 times. Then I picked up my phone and I looked up Philip Garrett at Garrett Baines, and I wrote his number in my notebook. It was 11:15 at night. I would call in the morning. I called Philip Garrett at 9 the following morning, the 24th of April. His receptionist was kind and efficient. Yes, Mr. Garrett knew the Holloway estate. Yes, he could see me. Could I come Thursday? I said yes in my diary, and felt for the first time since my father died something that wasn't grief. It was close to purpose. I also, that same morning, received a call from Diana. She was composed. She said she hoped I was resting. She said she was going to need to speak to me about the house situation, which was how she phrased it. The house situation. As though it were a logistical inconvenience rather than my childhood home. I've already been in touch with a solicitor, she said. Which solicited? A pause. I engaged someone from Leeds. Someone Camilla recommended. I see. I kept my voice level. What specifically were you hoping to discuss? Well, Kenneth's estate. The house, mainly. I've had advice that as his spouse, I have significant entitlement. We should probably let the solicitors speak to each other, I said. Of course. Her tone shifted, something slightly cooler. I'm only ringing because I want us to handle this properly, Margaret, without unpleasantness. Of course, said. What I didn't say, I know about the trust deed. My father told me everything. I have a copy in my flat right now. I didn't say it because something in her tone, the way she said, without unpleasantness, with that slight emphasis, as though unpleasantness were at her disposal, told me that information was power, and that I should not any of mine away before I had to. I had the appointment with Philip Garrett on Thursday. I would go, and I would listen, and then I would know what I was dealing with. On Wednesday afternoon, I drove over to Skipton Road. I wanted to retrieve some of my father's things. Some books I had helped him choose, the photograph that had always sat on his desk of me and Mother on holiday in Whitby when I was 7. It seemed wrong to leave them there, in a house with people who hadn't known him the way I had. I used the key I still had. The one Diana didn't know I'd had cut from the original years before, when I'd had a bad feeling I couldn't name and had acted on it quietly. It didn't work. The lock had been changed. I stood on the doorstep in the cold April air and tried the key twice, methodically, in case I was making an error. I was making an error. The lock, I could see it when I looked closely, the brass unweathered, recently fitted. I rang the bell. No answer. I rang Diana's mobile. It rang out. I went home. I sat at my kitchen table and I opened my notebook, and I wrote the date, and beneath it, lock changed, key no longer works. 2 days after funeral. Then I made myself a cup of tea, because my father had believed strongly in cups of tea as a response to adversity, and I thought about what he had written. Don't wait. Don't let anyone tell you that you have no right to that house. I would not wait. I would go to Philip Garrett, and then I would act. On Thursday morning, 3 days after the funeral, I arrived at Garrett & Baines at 9:30. Philip Garrett was 70-ish, compact, with reading glasses on a chain and the measured manner of a man who had spent 40 years watching families fall apart over property and had retained his fundamental equanimity. He offered me tea, which I accepted, and his condolences, which he gave without making them feel routine. "Your father came to see me 11 years ago," he said. After he told me he planned to marry again, he was very clear about what he wanted. "He left me a letter," I said. "He told me about the trust deed." Good. He was worried he might leave it too late. He folded his hands on the desk. "The arrangement is solid, Margaret. A deed of trust properly executed and registered. The house on Skipton Road has been held in trust for you since 2013. Your father had the right to live there for the rest of his life, with his spouse sharing that right as a life tenant. But the beneficial ownership was always yours, and now that he's passed, his life tenancy ends. Which means Diana has no right to the property." He was precise. "She retains a right to occupy as a surviving spouse under general law, which can be complex and varies. What she does have is ownership. The house belongs to you. Full stop. Any claim she makes to the title will fail, because it predates the marriage and was properly registered." "She's engaged a solicitor," I said. "They'll find out about the trust when they run their searches." "They should." A pause. "You said the lock has been changed 2 days ago." He was quiet for a moment. "We should act quickly. I'd recommend we write to her solicitor today, setting out the trust position and instructing her to give you access to the property. If she refuses, we can apply to the court for an order. She's going to be very angry," I said. He said, "Probably." He waited to see if that changed anything. It didn't. "Do it," I said. Philip Garrett sent a formal letter to Diana's solicitor, a firm in Leeds called Harts & Beck, on Thursday afternoon. By Friday morning, Harts & Beck had responded. The response was, to put it plainly, aggressive. They questioned the validity of the trust deed. They suggested it had been executed by a man not in full possession of his faculties. They requested a complete review of all documentation before any further action was taken. Philip Garrett read this to me over the telephone in a tone of professional calm that suggested he had heard this particular argument many times. "They'll claim he lacked it up," I said. "They'll try. He was 60 years old in 2013 and in full health. The deed was properly witnessed and notarized. It will not be a successful argument. But it will delay things. That's the strategy. Create enough uncertainty that you become exhausted and stop pushing. I thought of my father's letter. Don't let anyone tell you you have no right to that house. I won't stop pushing, I said. Good. In that case, I'd like to talk to you about the circumstances around the signing. Were there witnesses you're aware of who might be able to speak to your father's state of mind at the time? I thought about this. There was a neighbor, I said. Elaine Fielding. She's lived across the road since before I was born. Dad trusted her completely. Could she help? I'll go and go her. Elaine Fielding was 73 and had the look of a woman who had seen a great deal of the world and found it generally smaller than its own opinion of itself. She'd been at school with my mother. She had a cottage directly opposite our house and a garden that was, if anything, better maintained than my father's had been. She'd brought food over when Mum died, and she'd continued to bring food over at intervals for the next 27 years. With the consistent generosity of someone who simply believed that looking after people was what you did. She welcomed me in and sat me at her kitchen table and poured me tea before I had finished explaining what had happened. Then she sat across from me with both hands flat on the table and said, I expected something like this. Not exactly this, but something. Did you know about the trust deed? I said. I was a witness, she said. I stared at her. Kenneth asked me in March of 2013, she said. He'd been seeing Diana for about 6 months by then, and he said he was going to marry her, and he wanted to do the right thing by you, but he also wanted to protect himself from any future complications. He used the word complications. I signed the deed here at this table, with solicitor present. I remember it because I remember thinking how like your father it was to do everything correctly, inadvertently, without any fuss. You never said anything, I said. He asked me not to. She looked at me steadily. He was afraid of how Diana would receive it if she knew. I respected his wishes. He was a private man and it was his business to manage. Would you be willing to speak to a solicitor? To tell them what you remember? She didn't hesitate. Margaret, I've been waiting for someone to ask me. Absolutely yes. I drove home that afternoon and called Philip Garrett. I have a witness, I said. She was there. She signed it. There was a pause I couldn't interpret. Then, well, that rather clarifies things. I want to go back before I tell you what happened next. I want to tell you about the last Sunday. 3 weeks before he died, I came for dinner as usual. Deanna was there. Camille was not, for once. The absence of Camille changed the quality of the air in that house in a way that I noticed but couldn't have explained. It was easier. We were 3 people having dinner, and for one evening it felt something like it used to. Dad made his shepherd's pie, which was not technically a shepherd's pie because he used beef mince, and when I pointed this out he said it was his recipe and he could call it whatever he liked, which had always been his answer. The pie was perfect. It was always perfect. After dinner Diana went to read in the sitting room and Dad and I did the washing up together. He washed. We'd always done it that way. We talked about the school. I had a boy in year 3 that year who'd been struggling and had suddenly clicked with reading, and I told Dad about it in detail, because he always wanted detail. He asked the right questions. He said, "That's your doing that. You remember that when the job is frustrating." "I will," I said. There was a comfortable silence while we worked. The window above the sink faced the garden, and the garden was coming into its spring color. The daffodils were almost over, but the tulips were opening and the things he'd planted against the fence were doing exactly what he'd meant them to. "I need to tell you something," he said. He didn't look at me. He was looking at the garden. "There's a tin in my study wardrobe," he said. "At the back, behind the boxes." "Dad, don't open yet," he said. "Not while I'm here. When the time comes, you'll know," I said. He nodded once and handed me a casserole dish to dry, and we didn't talk about it again. That was 3 weeks before he died. I want you to understand what that conversation meant. He was telling me without telling me. He was a man who didn't make speeches and didn't dramatize and didn't create unnecessary scenes, and he was finding a way. The only way to tell me what he needed me to know. He was trusting me to understand and to wait, and to do the right thing when the moment came. He died 3 weeks later. I opened the tin the night they buried him, and I understood. And I waited the right amount of time, which was until Thursday morning, and then I went to Philip Garrett, and I began. I want you to know, if you've never experienced the death of a parent, that grief is not a clean thing. You don't grieve in one direction. You grieve for the person, and you grieve for the life you had with them, and you grieve for all the things that will now never happen, and sometimes, if the situation is the way mine was, you grieve for all the time you should have said more clearly, fought more clearly, been less afraid of difficulty. The notebook I'd been keeping for 2 years didn't feel like enough. The 3 Sundays I'd lost to Camille's schedule didn't feel recoverable. He had given me the tin. He had given me Philip Garrett's name. He had said, wait. So I didn't wait. I grieved on one side of my life and I fought on the other, and somehow the fighting made the grieving more bearable, because it was the thing I was doing for him. Hartz and Beck, Diana's firm, took 3 weeks to run their searches and review the documentation. The letter that arrived at Philip Garrett's office on the 15th of May contained 22 pages of argument. I read them all, at his desk, with a cup of tea going cold beside me. Their central position was this: that the deed of trust was not valid because Kenneth Holloway had failed to disclose its existence to Diana prior to marriage, and that this non-disclosure constituted a material misrepresentation that undermined the legality of the arrangement. They further argued that the trust, having been set up without Diana's knowledge or consent, had deprived her of a fair understanding of the asset position she was entering and should be set aside under principles of equitable remedy. They also raised, more quietly, the question of my father's capacity at the time of signing, noting that he had later suffered strokes and suggesting a full medical review of cognitive function in the relevant period would be appropriate. That last one, I said. Can they do that? They can raise it, Philip said. They won't get far with it. He was 60 years old and perfectly well. Any medical expert worth their fee will say so. He set the letter down. Their main argument, the non-disclosure, is more creative. It won't succeed, but it's designed to make proceedings longer and more expensive. They want me to give up, I said, or settle for something less than full ownership. Give Diana a right to occupy long-term, perhaps. She's already occupying. She changed the locks. Yes. He looked at me carefully. Margaret, I want to be honest with you about what this will involve. We're talking about a full court hearing. It will take months, possibly longer. It will be unpleasant. Diana will likely produce evidence of her life in that house, photographs, letters, testimony from Camille, to establish the depth of her connection. I sat that for a moment. What does the trust deed say? I said. Precisely. He turned to the document. He read the relevant clause. It was clear. It was unambiguous. It used plain language because my father had asked for plain language, and Philip Garrett was a man who believed in plain language. The house on Skipton Road, in all its parts, was to pass to Margaret Kathleen Holloway on the death of the trustee. That's me. That said, that's you. Then we fight, I said. Philip Garrett nodded and picked up his pen, and we began to plan. May dissolved into June. June into a long, difficult July. The formal legal process had begun, and with it came a kind of parallel reality in I was simultaneously living my ordinary life. Teaching year 3s, making dinner, calling friends, and engaged in something that felt like a low-grade emergency that never switched off. I was lucky in one respect. I had an ally who was not Philip Garrett. Her name was Fiona Askeith. She was a friend from university. We'd done our education training together, and she had gone on to become, of all things, a paralegal at a property law firm in York. We'd stayed close in the way that some French do. Irregular contact, but deep when we made it. Told her everything one evening in June, at her kitchen table, over a bottle of red wine. She listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she said, "They're going to make this about Diana's emotional attachment to the house. I know. So we make it about the law, which is clear. That's what Philip says. Philip is right." She refilled her glass. "What's their strongest argument, really? The non-disclosure? Yes. Has Philip found case law? He has 3 precedents." "Good." Back. "You know what concerns me more than their legal strategy? What they might do to the house while this is pending. Change things, remove things. Can they move furniture, artwork, objects, things that are your father's and therefore yours?" I hadn't thought about this. "What do?" I said. "Philip should be writing a formal letter of notification to them that the contents of the property are part of the estate and must not be removed or disposed of pending settlement." Philip the next morning. He wrote the letter at afternoon. Hartson Beck acknowledged it 4 days later. 2 weeks after that, Elaine Fielding gave her formal witness statement. She sat in Philip Garrett's office in a navy cardigan and low heels, and she spoke about the morning in March 2013 with the precision and confidence of someone who had prepared carefully and had nothing to hide. She described my father's manner that morning, clear, decided, calm. She described reading the document before signing. She described Philip Garrett's presence. She described everything. When she finished, Philip said, "Thank you, Mrs. Fielding. This is very helpful." Elaine looked at me across the table. "Your father was a good man," she said. "He deserved better than this." I kept my face steady. I said, "The drive home, I pulled over on a street outside Harrogate and sat for a few minutes. Not crying, or not exactly. Just sitting, letting the weight of it land for a moment, before I drove the rest of the way home and made dinner, and got ready to teach the next day. I thought about him washing up at the kitchen window. Looking at the garden, I thought, I'm doing it, Dad. I'm not stopping." The formal hearing was scheduled for the 17th of October. In the months between July and October, several things happened. Diana's solicitor attempted twice to negotiate a settlement. The first proposal was that I sign the house to Diana for a period of 10 years, after which it would transfer to me. The second was that Diana retain the right to occupy for the remainder of her life, with the property held in a secondary trust. Both were, I am told, actually quite generous from a property law perspective. Philip presented them to me. I said no to both. He looked at me carefully when I said this, in the way he had come to look at me when he wasn't sure I'd considered all the implications. "If we lose at hearing," he said, "you'll have less leverage. They might take the house. But you've told me we won't lose," I said. "I have. I believe it." "Then I trust Vice. We don't settle." I paused. "Do you understand what that house means to me? It's not an asset. My father built it. My mother lived in it. I learned everything I know about being a family in those rooms. Diana Mercer has lived there for 7 years, and she has spent that time erasing everything we were. She moved my father's to garage. She repainted my parents' bedroom. She changed the locks the day we put him in the ground. I don't want a compromise. I want the house." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, I understand." We prepared for hearing. The preparation was more intensive than I'd expected. Philip walked me through the process exhaustively. I would be cross-examined by Hartson Beck's barrister. They would challenge my understanding of the trust, attempt to establish that I had been aware of the arrangement for some time and had been working with my father to conceal it from Diana, and try to use this to suggest bad faith. Philip had responses for all of it. I rehearsed until I could give my evidence calmly and clearly. I did not tell Camille what was happening. I did not speak to Diana at all in these months. Philip had advised that all communication go through solicitors, and I had been grateful for this instruction because as I did not trust myself to speak to Diana without saying things that could be used against me. I taught my year 3s. I went for walks. I visited Elaine Fielding twice, and we had tea and she asked after the case, and I told her what I could, and she nodded with the satisfaction of a woman who had committed to a just cause and intended to see it through. The night before the hearing, I went to bed early and lay awake. Not from fear, or not entirely. There was something almost concentrated about the feeling, all of the previous 2 years. The notebooks, the tin, Philip's office, Elaine's statement, the negotiations, the waiting, all of it narrowing to tomorrow, to a courtroom in Harrogate, to a judge who had never met my father. I thought about what I would say if I could have said anything to my father. I thought. I kept my promise. I opened the tin. The hearing lasted 2 days. I will not pretend I enjoyed it. Cross-examination is not designed to be comfortable, and Hartson Beck's barrister, a woman in her 40s called Susanna Price, precise and methodical, was very good at her job. She asked me about the biscuit tin, with a tone that suggested I might have put it there myself. She asked about my relationship with Philip Garrett in a way that implied a conspiracy I had never had. She asked about the notebooks I had kept. That last one surprised her, I think, that I had notebooks. Philip had told me to mention them if relevant. I mentioned them. 31 entries in the first one, I said. Dates, observations, concerns. I have kept records for 2 years. She moved on. She spent longer on Elaine Fielding, which was predictable if they could undermine Elaine's testimony. The witnessing of the trust deed became uncertain. But Elaine Fielding had lived across that road for 50 years and had the kind of unimpeachable manner that came from having nothing to conceal and a very clear memory. She repeated exactly what she had said in her statement. She did not waver. Diana gave evidence on the second day. She was composed in the way she had always been composed, the way that I had once mistaken for self-possession and had later understood to be a kind of practiced surface. She spoke about her life in the house, the years she had spent there, her care for my father during his illness. She was, I have to admit, effective. Camille gave evidence after her. She was less effective. She claimed to have believed the house was part of my father's estate, and therefore Diana's, by right as surviving spouse. When pressed on how she had arrived at this belief, the answer was circular. Her mother had told her. Her mother had been given advice by their solicitor. Their solicitor had told them they had a strong claim. Philip's barrister, a man named James Whitworth who had the build of a rugby player and the quiet of a librarian, pointed out that a solicitor's assessment of a claim is not the same as a legal right, and that the existence of the trust had been a matter of public record since 2013, which no amount of spousal expectation could override. The judge reserved her judgment for 3 weeks. 3 weeks, Philip had warned me, and I had accepted it intellectually. In practice, 3 weeks of waiting is its own particular exercise. I was at school. I was grading work. I was making dinner. And at some point in every day I thought, the judge is thinking up my father's house. The decision arrived on a Wednesday morning in early November. Called me at 9:15. Are you sitting, Dad? Philip. We've won. Full judgment in your favor. The trust is valid and enforceable. The house on Skipton Road is yours. Diana Mercer has been given 30 days to vacate. I put the phone down on the table and sat very still for a moment. Out the window, my neighbors were walking. A car went past. An ordinary Wednesday morning. The house on Skipton Road is yours. I picked up the phone again. Sorry, I said. I just needed a moment. I nodded. Well, I'll write to Hartzenbeck today. You'll get the formal documents within the week. And then, he paused, and I thought I could something approaching warmth in his careful voice. You get the keys. Diana did not fight the order. I had expected another application, another delay, another round of correspondence. But she didn't. 30 days after the ruling, she vacated the house on Skipton Road. Camille helped her move. Philip Garrett arranged for me to attend with a locksmith on the 31st day, and I stood on the doorstep that my father had laid in 1979, while the locksmith changed the lock to one that I would hold the key to. And I did not allow myself to cry until I was inside with the door closed behind me. The house had been partially emptied. She had taken her own things, the furniture she'd brought, the curtains she'd chosen, the artwork she'd hung. She had left behind everything that had been there before her. My father's bookshelves, his remaining books, the kitchen extension he and Malcolm had built in 1991. The armchair that she'd put in the garage was still in the garage. I moved it back to the sitting room. It didn't look the same as it had. 7 years of Diana's occupancy had changed too many things for it to look the same. The walls were wrong colors. The layout of the kitchen had been rearranged. The garden, which had her project too, in fairness, was different, though not worse. But the bones were there. The front step my father had laid. The bookshelves, the low ceilings and the old radiators, the view from the kitchen window to the garden. I walked through every room. I stood in his study for a long time. It was empty now. Diana had taken the furniture she'd added. But the room itself was as he'd left it, the fitted shelves he'd built still there, the carpet he'd chosen still down. I thought about sitting here with him, going through the drawers. I thought about the biscuit tin. I thought about my mother, who had never known this room because he'd built it after she died, but who would have loved it, as she'd loved every room he built her. Diana Mercer, as of the last I heard, rented a flat in Leeds near Camille. She had not reached out. I had not reached out either. What she had tried to do, the rush title transfer, the changed locks, the 7 years of slow erasure, I cannot easily forgive. I don't intend to spend my life trying. She had her reasons, whatever they were. Camille has not spoken to me since the hearing. This is fine. We were never friends, and I don't require anything from her. I hope she will, in the general and rather distant way you can hope this for people you don't know. Philip Garrett sent me a card. It's your father would be pleased. Well done. I put it in the biscuit tin. I didn't move into the house immediately. I kept my flat for another 6 months. I needed to go slowly. I needed to understand what the house was now versus what it had been. I went over most weekends. I repainted rooms. I repainted my old bedroom first, stripped off whatever Camille had do it and found, and beneath it, a small section of the old wallpaper that had been there when I was a child. Yellow flowers on a white ground. I didn't repaper the whole wall. I cut a small section of the old paper and framed it and put it on the mantelpiece in the sitting room, where the armchair is now. I asked Malcolm if he'd like to come over and see the kitchen extension. He came on a Saturday in January and stood in the kitchen for a while looking at it and then said, "We did a good job." He always worried the ceiling join wasn't right. It's absolutely right. He seemed pleased. Elaine Fielding comes for tea regularly. She brings biscuits, and we sit in the kitchen and look at the garden. And she tells me things about my parents that I didn't know. Small things. The kind of things that only a neighbor who has watched 2 people live their life for dead know. I treasure these. Last spring I planted dahlias along the fence, not because Diana grew them, because my father once told me my mother had wanted dahlias and he'd never gotten round to planting them. It seemed like the right thing. The house is not perfect. The radiators are still older than me, and the draught under the front door is still impossible to cure entirely. I have replaced some furniture and kept some, and I am still in the process of understanding which rooms want to be which color. It is a project. It will probably always be a project, but it is mine. I mean that in the way my father meant it when he told me he'd mixed the cement himself. The front step, that was him. The bookshelves, the kitchen extension, the sweet peas he grew along the fence every summer, which I am working on growing myself, with considerably less success so far. But I will get there. My name is Margaret Holloway. I am 38 years old. My father built this house in 1979 with a mortgage he could barely afford and a second job driving lorries at weekends. He wanted me to have it. He did everything he could, in his quiet and cautious way, to make sure that I did. And I do. Thank you for staying with me through this story. I know it's been long and in places difficult. That's the thing about these stories. The difficulty is the point. Families are complicated. Grief is complicated. The people who hurt us often aren't cartoons, they're real, with their own histories. And the betrayal cuts deeper, because it comes from people who were supposed to be safe. If you are dealing with something like this, a property dispute, an inheritance you believe has been mishandled, a situation where someone is telling you that you have no right to something that should be yours, please take the advice my father gave me. Find a good solicitor, get proper advice, document what you can when you can, and do not anyone wear you down with delay and complexity until you give up. The legal system is slow and it is expensive and it is uncomfortable. But it exists for a reason, and sometimes it works. I also want to say this. If you are in a situation where someone in your family is being slowly isolated, where their world is narrowing, where you are receiving less information, where the people around them seem to be managing your access to instinct, write it down, not to be litigious, just to see the pattern, because patterns, once you can see them, are harder to unsee. My father gave me the best gift he could, not the house, the letter and the tin and the instruction not to wait. Don't wait. If this story resonated with you, please leave a comment. I read them all. Have you experienced something like this? I want to hear your story. If you know someone who needs to hear this, a friend, a family member, someone in a situation that doesn't feel right, please share this video with them. You might be giving them exactly what they need. Like and subscribe for more stories like this one. I'll see you in the next one.